Hi everybody and welcome to Scuba Diver magazine, your very new favourite place to talk about scuba diving. So in this video I'm going to be talking about air integrated dive computers and what your options are when you're choosing one. So air integrated dive computers are fairly common now and they tend to be sort of built into all dive computers except the the very bottom tier dive computers in a manufacturer's range, and normally about 2/3 of their dive computer range will have some kind of air integration. Investing in an air integrated dive computer can be very beneficial for you though, and all it really means is that your dive computer knows exactly how much pressure is in the tank, and there are quite a few benefits to this. So the first being that you only have to look at one screen whilst you're diving. You don't have to look at your dive computer to check your no decompression limit and your depth and then put that down and then find your gauges to check how much gas you have left. It's all on your dive computer, all on one screen. Your dive computer can also do some very clever stuff if it knows your tank pressure, because it also knows how quickly that number is changing, so it can work out your air consumption over time, which is nice to know so that you can see how you are improving over time with your air consumption. But your dive computer also knows how deep you are and what the ambient pressure is, so it can work out in real time roughly how long your remaining gas will actually last based on how deep you are and how fast you're breathing. So it can display a very simple airtime remaining in minutes. So if you stay at that depth and that current breathing rate, your air will last 20 minutes, for example. If you then shallow up, that number will start to increase because of the reduction in the ambient pressure. So it's a really handy way of knowing when to change your depth based on your remaining gas, and minutes remaining kind of means a bit more to your brain than just, oh, so many bar or PSI. You can also set up alerts on many dive computers so that when you get down to a certain tank pressure, it will start beeping or vibrating to tell you. A traditional analog gauge will only just point to a number, so if you're not checking that gauge often, it will just keep dropping and dropping. It's not going to alert you in any way unless you look at it. So if you want a more persistent alert, you can set up an alert so that you know when you reach whatever pressure you've chosen, and you'll never be surprised. So if you're shopping around for an air integrated dive computer and you want to learn a little bit more about them, let's talk about air integrated dive computers and how they work. The simplest air integrated dive computers are fitted to a hose that attaches to your regulator's high pressure port, effectively replacing your SPG, your submersible pressure gauge. That way, instead of an analog gauge or gauges, depending on what setup you have, you just have your dive computer on the end of that hose. These free up your wrists and pretty much eliminate the problem of forgetting your dive computer on a dive, or your dive computer slipping off your wrist because the buckle wasn't tight enough, because the computer is literally attached to your regulator, so you can't go anywhere without it. The downside comes in just that it's physically attached to your regulator, so if you want to get your dive profile off your dive computer after a dive to fill in your logbook, then you often have to take your entire regulator set, and you also have to pack your dive computer in with your regulators, which can actually damage the computer, especially the screen, if either you or the baggage handlers are not particularly careful. Some hose dive computers do have bayonet fittings so that you can disconnect them on the go when they're depressurized, but not all do, so do your research first and sort of see if the dive computer you're looking at does have a quick release function. Hose dive computers will replace your analog gauges, but they do mean that you do need to keep the batteries topped up, because if your battery ever runs out during the dive, you won't know how deep you are, you won't know how long you've been under the water, water or how much air you have left, and they're all pretty important to know. So just keep that in mind if you ever do invest in one, and keep that battery charged up so it's never going to run out during a dive. Now, the popularity of these hose integrated dive computers seems to be pretty regional, and they're not too popular where I come from, but I don't really know why, because they are actually really good dive computers. Maybe it's just that wireless dive computers are a bit more popular and you tend to get a wider choice of computer models and features. Most manufacturers only make one or maybe even two hose integrated dive computers in their entire range. But anyway, let's talk about wireless integrated dive computers. A lot of dive computers today have wireless air integration, so you'll need a small transmitter that fits onto your regulator, which is just a little battery-powered beacon that fits to a high pressure port on your regulator that just broadcasts your tank pressure a very short distance to any dive computers in the local area that are listening out on that particular frequency. Wireless computers give you a greater freedom because you can have your dive computer on your wrist with no heavy hoses connecting the two. You do of course need a second high pressure port on your regulators because I tend to prefer to keep a backup analog gauge that just can never run out of battery or lose signal. I always like that sort of analog redundant backup. If you know that you've got a full battery in your transmitter and your dive computer and you trust it 100%, then you can definitely dive with just a transmitter and no gauges, which is a lot lighter and a lot neater. But I'll always dive with a backup just in case, because that's how I was taught to dive. There are a few different types of transmitters too, so you can't just buy any old transmitter and any dive computer and just try to pair the two. They actually have to be able to talk to one another. There are lots of different languages and lots of different frequencies. Even in the same brand, Suunto for example, Suunto make two different transmitters that work in ever so slightly different ways, and one transmitter will work with one dive computer, but it won't work with another Suunto. So you have to make sure that you get the right pair. There are a rare few transmitters and underwater beacons that work with some dive computers that are much more powerful, but right now I'm only really aware of one brand that uses that, and it's Liquivision. But these transmitters can transmit over much greater distances and transmit much more information than just your tank pressure. So one could assign sort of names to each different transmitter. You can have up to like 10 different transmitters in an entire group, and you can give each of them a name, and you can even have one computer that could sort of see up to 10 different transmitters, and then you could even connect another one that's connected onto a laptop on the back of a boat nearby, which can literally send text messages to each diver as long as you've got sort of someone up there as surface support. So that's very, very clever. Another transmitter in their range acts a bit like a GPS beacon, so you put that off the back of the boat, and it means that you can always find your way back to that boat, because it kind of shows up on your wrist as a kind of radar, so you can see, oh, go in this direction to get back to the boat. But these are very rare and they're a touch more expensive than just a traditional standard transmitter. So don't be too surprised if you're doing research and you don't find anything like this without doing a lot of digging and sort of research and of course investment. And they're very exclusive, so they only work with that one brand. So don't be surprised if you don't find them on a simple sort of Google search. There are some transmitters, however, more sort of traditional transmitters, that can work with multiple dive computers because the people that make their transmitters share this technology with other companies. So pelagic transmitters will work with Aqualung, they'll work with oceanic dive computers, they'll also work with shearwater dive computers, and they're fairly interchangeable because they're basically the same on the inside. So an Aqualung transmitter will actually work with a shearwater dive computer. They just have a different name stamped on the outside, but do double check this first. There are only a handful of frequencies that these transmitters can use though, and there are just a ton of individual transmitters out there in the water, so the last thing that you want to do is to pair your dive computer to someone else's transmitter, thinking that you have more gas than you actually do on the dive, but then when they start to swim a little bit away from you, you lose signal and you have no idea how much gas you have. So transmitters will transmit on rotating frequencies, so the chances of two transmitters on the same boat on the same frequency are actually fairly slim. But this means that pairing transmitters to your dive computer is something that you need to be used to doing. Pairing your transmitter or transmitters, because you can often pair multiple transmitters if you're diving multiple tanks and want them all connected to one dive computer. It can be easy and it can take some finesse depending on the actual transmitter. So one type is called a permanent transmitter, and pairing a permanent transmitter is pretty easy. So whenever you like, before the dive obviously, you just type in the transmitter's serial number into the dive computer and it will always be listening out for that one particular transmitter. Shinto tank pod and pelagic transmitters tend to work this way, and I prefer the system because until you delete that serial number out of your dive computer, it will always be listening for that one individual transmitter on every single dive. The alternative is a non-permanent transmitter, and non-permanent transmitters have a range of 20 or 30 different frequencies, and that just at the beginning of the dive it just randomizes one particular frequency. From time to time, basically you need to sort of pressurize your regulators, but you only have a couple of minutes to pair your dive computer to it once you've actually pressurized it, because after that first 2 minutes of being pressurized, that transmitter stops sending out a pairing signal. So to pair these, obviously read the manual that came with it first, because it may be slightly different, but the usual kind of procedure is, first of all, have a quick look around, make sure that no one else nearby is doing the exact same, because you can very easily pairs to theirs by mistake. But get your dive computer ready first. Most people just jump straight in and they just pressurize that tank. But no, you want to prepare your dive computer first. What you want to do is clear off any existing codes that might be from the previous dive. So you'll often see that it's set to channel 14, for example, from the last dive. So you need to clear that out. And now that your dive computer is looking for a transmitter, then you turn your tank on and keep your dive computer really nice and close as possible to that transmitter, so there's no way it can get confused or it can have a weak intermittent signal. In a few seconds, it'll hopefully announce that you're actually paired up, and it should display your tank pressure on the screen as 230 bar or whatever you've got in your tank. Now, to double check it's actually paired correctly, close your tank valve and press the purge button on your second stage, and the gas pressure inside your regulator should drop, and your dive computer should register your pressure drop. If it doesn't, then you may be paired to someone else's. Now, you shouldn't have to do this before every single dive. Non-permanent transmitters, they're really not that bad. But if it's been more than a day, about 24 hours or so since your last paired dive, you may need to pair it again. But the important thing is that your dive computer is ready in the first minute of actually turning that transmitter on. If you miss that first minute or two window, then you have to depressurize, and then you have to wait 10 minutes or so for your transmitter to switch off and go back to sleep before you can start the procedure again. Because after that first 2 minutes, all it does is just send out a beacon every now and then saying, I've got this much pressure. I've got this much pressure. So it's that first couple of minutes that are really important. There are a few more helpful tips when you get a transmitter. The first one is that I like to fit mine to a short high pressure hose, normally something about 6 inches or 15 centimeters long, nothing too long, because you've effectively got a really smallish, really expensive piece of kit bolted really solidly onto your first stage, and if you bump that against something in or out of the water, you now have a very expensive paperweight that used to be a transmitter. And worse, you may actually damage the thread on your first stage, so now you need to buy a new regulator as well. So yeah, so I fit mine to a short hose, so it has a bit more kind of movement from knocks, but between your hose and your transmitter, you'll also need a swivel pin. So a swivel pin is just a small little thing that has two teeny tiny little O-rings on it, and without this swivel pin, air will just leak out everywhere. So get a swivel pin if you're putting it onto a hose. Without a hose, if you're fitting it straight onto your first stage, you do not need a swivel pin, but if you are fitting it to a hose, you are going to need a swivel pin. The broadcasting range of most transmitters isn't amazing neither, so if you put it on your right hand side and your dive computer is on your left, that can actually be stretching it at times for its broadcasting range, and you might have signal loss from time to time. It's also not a great idea to have your transmitter on your buddy connected to your dive computer. It's a great idea if you're a parent and you want to keep in touch with your kids' air supply, but transmitters aren't really made to broadcast that far. It's not what they're made for. People have tried it before, and you have to be really close. It's just easier just to ask them every now and then how much gas you have. If you're diving with multiple transmitters really close together, just double check that they don't interfere with one another. It's not too much of an issue anymore, but older transmitters can work on two similar frequencies, and they can just kind of confuse the dive computer and interrupt one another's signal. So do your research on which generation of transmitters you're actually buying as well. A lot of transmitters also have small lights on them because the very first generation of transmitters had absolutely nothing on them. So you had no idea whether your transmitter was working or whether it was just not pairing to your dive computer, or whether it just ran out of batteries. There was no way of telling. So most transmitters now have a small LED somewhere on them that just pulses every now and then just to let you know that it's actually working. But they're usually pretty faint so that they don't use too much battery power, but this means that they can be quite hard to see, especially in bright light. So yeah, if you can't see anything, just kind of cup your hands around it, try and make it really dark, and then you'll probably actually be able to see it. If it's not blinking at all, then you might have run out of battery. Others use a light to communicate with your buddy and have a traffic light system that changes with your tank pressure. So if your buddy is swimming behind you, they can actually see roughly how much gas you have left in your tank. Something like, it depends on the brand, but it'll be something like over half a tank, it'll flash green. Anything less than half a tank, it turns amber, and then below a quarter of a tank, it goes down to red. So if you haven't noticed that you're low on gas, your buddy actually might be able to go, oh, hey, he's on red, and then get your attention. So that's air integrated dive computers. Most dive computers actually have this function in some way so that you have the choice to connect your dive computer to your tank pressure. Even if you don't want air integration right now, it might be worth thinking about getting a dive computer that actually has it on the inside. You don't have to buy a dive computer and a transmitter right away. It's always something that you can upgrade at a later date if you choose to. Your dive computer will work perfectly fine without a transmitter, but 2 years down the road, if you then change your mind and you feel like using a transmitter, at least you do have that function built in. But if you don't have that feature built in, you now need to buy a new dive computer that does. It's up to you, obviously. For me, I actually quite like diving with a transmitter. It means that I can analyze my gas consumption after the dive. It shows up on my logbook on my dive computer as my kind of air consumption rate, and I can analyze that after the fact. I also have my pressure alarm, so I never miss a turning point. But hey, what do you guys think about air integrated dive computers? Are you thinking about an air integrated dive computer? Are there any questions that we didn't cover here? Let us know in the comments below, and we will answer them down in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Scuba Diver magazine channel by clicking that little red button. At least it's usually red anyway. Sometimes it changes color, but yeah, red. If it's a red button, click it. not any red button, the red button that says subscribe. Click on that, that would be great. Thank you for watching, and of course, safe diving.